Harold and Margaret Whitmore were the kind of couple everyone in Willow Creek admired. 60 years of marriage, a house full of memories and a love story that had stood the test of time. But on the night of their diamond anniversary, Margaret was found dead at the bottom of the stairs, and Harold, her devoted husband, claimed it was a tragic accident. What no one knew was that, for months, Harold had been watching her, obsessing, unraveling, and hidden inside their perfect life was a secret he believed was worth killing for. Harold and Margaret Whitmore had what many called a storybook marriage. In the quiet town of Willow Creek, they were more than just residents. They were symbols of what it meant to stay together through life's ups and downs. For 60 years, their bond had seemed unshakable. Everyone in town knew their love story. They'd met in high school during a fall dance in night. Harold had been shy, awkward, but kind. Margaret had been confident, gentle, and full of laughter. They had walked home together that night, and from then on, they were rarely seen apart. They married young, built a modest life, and never moved far from the home they first bought together. Harold worked as a watchmaker, quietly fixing the broken pieces of other people's lives, one gear at a time. Margaret was a school teacher, known for her patience and her handwritten thank you notes. Together they raised 2 children who had long since moved out of town, started families of their own, and returned only during the holiday. Still, the Whitmores remained the heartbeat of the neighborhood, a gentle, familiar presence. Their home, a 2-story colonial with white shutters and ivy creeping along the walls, was always impeccably kept. It was filled with memories, faded photo albums, travel souvenirs, dried roses from long-forgotten anniversaries. They spent their days tending the garden, walking to the corner cafe, and attending church on Sunday. In the evenings, Margaret would sit by the window reading, while Harold worked quietly at his workbench in the basement, fixing wristwatches that no one else knew how to repair anymore. As their 60th wedding anniversary approached, excitement grew, not just for the Whitmores, but for the entire town. Friends and neighbors insisted on throwing a party. A small, intimate gathering was planned at their home. Margaret had been especially thrilled, gathering old photographs, ordering decorations, and even writing a short speech to thank everyone for being part of their journey. She kept smiling to herself, humming songs from their wedding day, her eyes shining with warmth. To the outside world, their story was still perfect, but something had changed. Quietly, gradually, and no one had noticed, least of all Margaret. Harold had been different lately, more withdrawn, more restless. At first Margaret had chalked it up to age. At 82, Harold's body moved slower, his hands trembled slightly when tying his shoes. But this wasn't physical, it was something deeper. He had become quiet, not his usual silence, but a cold, watchful stillness. He watched her when she didn't notice, stared longer than he should when she laughed or touched his arm. His eyes didn't soften the way they used to. He had started locking his workshop when he left it. Started writing things down in a little leather notebook he kept hidden in his coat pocket. He never said anything, never questioned her directly, but something had begun to darken in his gaze. Margaret, ever cheerful, seemed unaware. She kept planning the party, inviting people they hadn't seen in years, wrapping small gifts for the guests. She began leaving the house more often, meeting with florists, speaking with a photographer, sneaking off to what she called little errands. And Harold noticed, every trip out, every new phone number on the landline, every mysterious package that arrived, Harold kept. He began staying up later, long after Margaret had gone to sleep, sitting alone in the den, the glow of a single lamp on his face, staring at nothing in particular. When he finally did go to bed, it was with slow, measured steps, his mind turning over something he couldn't yet name, or would. There was no evidence of a problem, no loud arguments, no slammed doors, just silence, a slow, creeping silence that spread between them like a shadow no one could see. And underneath that silence, something else, a tension, a suspicion, a quiet dread that Harold couldn't explain. Everyone thought the Whitmores were the happiest couple in Willow Creek, that they would grow old together in peace, but what no one saw, what no one could have guessed, was that their perfect love story had already begun to unravel, and it wouldn't be long before that unraveling ended in death. It began with the little things, a shift in routine here, a new habit there, small changes that most people wouldn't notice, but Harold did. He had always been observant, a man of detail. Years of repairing intricate watches had trained him to spot the tiniest misalignment, a fraction of a second, a misplaced gear. He saw it all. And now he was noticing that something about Margaret didn't quite fit the rhythm of their life anymore. It started when she began taking afternoon walks alone. At first Harold didn't think much of it. Margaret liked fresh air, and sometimes she'd walk to the local market to pick up a few things. But now she was gone longer than usual. She came back with bags from places he didn't recognize. Once she returned with a scarf, new, stylish, a shade of blue he didn't remember her ever wearing. She said she found it on sale. Harold said nothing, but he wrote it down in his notebook. Blue scarf. New, 3:15 p.m. return. Then came the phone call. Margaret had always been social, but now she was picking up the receiver in the kitchen and walking into the hallway to talk in hushed tones. When Harold asked who it was, she'd shrug and say, "Just one of the ladies from church, or an old friend from the book club." The calls never lasted long, but they always ended with a soft smile or a distant look in her eyes. It wasn't just the calls, it was her reaction after them. Her mood would shift ever so slightly, lighter, as if she were keeping a secret she didn't mind carrying. Harold tried to ignore it, but the more he tried, the more his thoughts dug deeper. He began listening at the door after she answered the phone. He stood silently at the top of the stairs, ear tilted, straining to catch a name, a sentence, anything. But Margaret was careful, and he found nothing, at least, nothing obvious. When she started going into town twice a week instead of once, Harold followed her. He told her he was staying home to clean the basement or polish old clocks. But after she left, he'd grab his coat, wait 10 minutes, and walk behind her at a distance. One day she went into a flower shop, came out smiling with a bouquet of white roses, Harold's favorite. Another day she sat alone at a cafe, then was joined by a man Harold didn't recognize. The two spoke for 20 minutes. Margaret laughed. The man leaned in. Harold, watching from across the street, felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He didn't sleep that night. The image of the man stayed in his mind. Tall, younger than them, perhaps in his late 50s, wearing a tailored coat and polished shoes. He looked comfortable with Margaret, too comfortable. Harold didn't mention it. He only made a new entry in his notebook: cafe on Maple, man in gray coat, laughed together. 2. The notebook grew heavier with each passing week. Receipts he found in the trash, small notes Margaret had written in a different handwriting, even a lipstick shade he didn't remember her owning. Harold kept collecting clues, convinced that they all pointed to the same conclusion. She was seeing someone. She was preparing to leave him, maybe not physically, but emotionally. She was already gone. He began checking the mail before she could. One afternoon, he found a postcard with no return address. On it was a sketch of a coastal town, and written on the back in looping script, "So glad we've reconnected, can't wait to see you again." The message wasn't signed with Margaret's full name, but the handwriting, it looked familiar. He confronted neither her nor the sender. He didn't ask. Instead he filed it away, beneath the floorboard in his workshop with the others. He was saving the evidence, all of it. Margaret remained cheerful, unaware. She made plans for the anniversary, hummed old love songs in the kitchen, talked out inviting their grandchildren to stay the weekend. But Harold no longer heard her words as promises. To him they sounded like distractions, attempts to cover up her betrayal. The silence between them grew louder. Every smile she gave him now looked like a lie, every touch, a trick. He no longer saw his wife, he saw a stranger in her skin, and though she still kissed him good night, Harold had already made up his mind. Something was happening behind his back. He didn't know the full truth yet, but he was going to find out, and when he did, he wasn't sure what he'd do with it. 3 weeks before their anniversary, Harold discovered something that shattered the final pieces of his trust. It was late afternoon, and Margaret had gone out again. "Another errand," she said with that same lightness in her voice that Harold had grown to dread. The sky outside was overcast, and the wind picked up around the old oak tree in their yard as Harold climbed the stairs, drawn by a gnawing instinct he could no longer suppress. He told himself he was just looking for batteries, but when he entered the bedroom, his steps slowed. His eyes went to Margaret's nightstand. She always kept it tidy: a few books, her reading glasses, a bottle of hand cream. But there was something new that day, a faint bulge under a stack of greeting cards. It wasn't visible unless you were looking for it. He reached down and lifted the cards. Beneath them was an envelope, plain, cream-colored, no writing. He stared at it for several seconds, as if touching it would confirm something irreversible. Then he opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It was Margaret, unmistakably, wearing the same soft gray sweater she had worn just 2 weeks ago. She was seated in a dimly lit restaurant, her face turned slightly to the right, smiling at someone just outside the frame. But what caught Harold's attention was that she wasn't alone. Beside her, leaning in, was the man from the cafe, the one Harold had seen her with. His face was clearer now, salt and pepper hair, clean-shaven, handsome in a quiet, self-assured way. The two of them were smiling at each other, their hands resting on the edge of the table, nearly touching. Harold's heart pounded as he examined the back of the photo. There was a date written in blue ink, recent, only 18 days earlier. He sat on the bed, the photo clutched in his trembling hand, staring at it as if it might rearrange itself and tell a different story. But it did. The image stayed the same, clear, damning. For Harold, the photograph confirmed everything he had feared. The quiet walks, the phone calls, the secretive tone. He imagined the conversations they must have had, the shared glances, the laughter. In his mind the scene expanded, Margaret leaning closer, whispering, maybe even touching the man's hand. Every unspoken fear came rushing to the surface, no longer doubts, but conclusions. This was why she had seemed so happy lately. This was why she had been glowing. It wasn't the party, it wasn't the milestone, it was him. Harold placed the photo back into the envelope, slid it into his coat pocket, and sat in silence. He didn't cry, he didn't rage, he simply felt something inside of him begin to hollow out, like the ticking center of a clock winding down to its final second. That night he said nothing. Margaret returned, humming a tune, placing a small paper bag on the counter. She told him she'd picked up special chocolate truffles for their party, his favorite. She kissed his cheek. Harold stood stiff, cold. He smiled, but it was forced. She didn't seem to notice. Over the next few days, Harold carried the photograph everywhere he went. He looked at it during his morning walks, studied it in the privacy of the basement. He tried to figure out where it had been taken, what time of day, who might have taken it. But the background was vague, just wine glasses, dim lighting, a flicker of a candle. He didn't show the photo to anyone, not their children, not their friends. He knew how it would sound, how everyone would try to talk him down, tell him he was overreacting. But Harold trusted his eyes more than any comforting lie. In his mind, Margaret was no longer the woman he had married. She was something else, someone who smiled at another man when Harold wasn't looking, someone who could carry on an entire relationship in the shadow. The worst part wasn't the betrayal, it was how long she had kept it hidden, the deception, the ease with which she moved through their home, their life, as though nothing had changed. Harold felt like a guest in his own marriage, a ghost watching the final act of a play he no longer understood. He knew he couldn't confront her yet. He needed more, proof, motive, maybe even revenge. The photo was only the beginning, and the clock as always was still ticking. The day of the anniversary arrived with a deceptive sense of calm. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and their house on Linden Street looked picture perfect, just as it always had. White balloons lined the fence and the garden, carefully tended by Margaret for years, was in full bloom. The scent of roses and fresh-cut grass filled the air. Guests began to arrive mid-afternoon, family members from out of town, old friends from the neighborhood, even a few of Harold's former clients from his watch repair days. Everyone came with warm smiles, hand-wrapped gifts, and congratulatory hugs. Inside the house, laughter echoed. Photos from the past 6 decades were arranged on boards in the living room. Young Harold in a crisp, navy suit, Margaret in a modest wedding dress, their children as toddlers, their first family dog, vacations, anniversaries, holiday. Each image told a story, a shared memory, a promise of time spent and time endured. Margaret floated through the house with grace, wearing a soft blue dress that matched her eyes, thanking guests, and making sure everyone had something to eat or drink. Her hair was pinned up neatly, her makeup light and elegant. She was glowing, truly radiant, and people noticed. She looked younger, somehow energized by the moment. Harold, however, was quiet, distant. He wore his best suit, polished his shoes, combed his hair. He did everything expected of him, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He shook hands, accepted compliments, and posed for photos, but inside he was somewhere else, somewhere darker. In his inner coat pocket, the photograph remained, folded and creased from too many times being held, studied, obsessed over. He hadn't let it go. It had become a part of him, an invisible wedge that separated him from the warmth of the moment. Every laugh Margaret gave, every kind word she spoke, Harold measured against the image of her sitting in that restaurant, smiling at the man in the gray coat. He watched her throughout the evening, tracking her movements as if she were a stranger in his house. He noted who she talked to, how long she lingered in conversation, how she tilted her head when she listened. Everything seemed calculated to him now, every smile felt rehearsed. When it came time for speeches, Margaret stood in front of their guests, holding a small note card. Her voice trembled slightly, but only with emotion. She spoke of love, endurance and what it meant to grow old together. She shared a story about their first home, and how Harold had once built her a jewelry box by hand. She called him her constant, her anchor. Everyone clapped, some cried. Harold clapped too, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about the jewelry box. He was thinking about the photograph, about the man, about the postcard she had hidden away. The guests left slowly, giving long hugs and wishing them many more happy years. By 9:30 p.m., the house was quiet again. The lights were dimmed, the dishes stacked in the sink, the champagne glasses half drunk and scattered across tables. Margaret was upstairs changing into her nightgown, humming softly from behind the closed door. Harold moved through the house like a shadow. Something in him had unraveled. The celebration had only deepened the feeling of betrayal. He saw her joy not as shared happiness, but as deception worn like a mask. It enraged him that she could play the role of devoted wife so well. It enraged him that no one else could see through it. He went upstairs without a word. What happened next, no one could say for certain. There was no scream, no sound of struggle, just a dull, sickening thud that no one heard except Harold himself. When morning came, the house was still. A neighbor, concerned after Margaret hadn't answered the phone, stopped by and knocked. No answer. The door was unlocked. They stepped inside, called out, and then they saw her. Margaret lay motionless at the bottom of the stairs, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, her neck broken. The look on her face was frozen mid-expression, somewhere between surprise and terror. Harold was sitting in the kitchen, quiet, composed, his hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee. He said she had fallen, that she must have slipped on the last step in the dark. The paramedics found no immediate reason to doubt him, but something in the room didn't feel right. Something about Harold's calmness, something about the look in his eyes. The perfect anniversary had ended in death, and the story the town thought they knew was starting to fall apart. In the days following Margaret's death, the town of Willow Creek was draped in quiet mourning. Sympathy cards piled up on Harold's front porch, some with handwritten letters recounting memories of Margaret's kindness. Neighbors brought over casseroles, lit candles, and told each other how tragic it all was, how unfair. 60 years of love, ended by a simple misstep on the stair. Everyone accepted the story easily. It was easier that way. But under the surface, something else was brewing. The medical examiner's initial report ruled the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head and neck, consistent with a fall. No signs of struggle, no defensive wound, just a terrible accident. Harold told the authorities that Margaret had gone upstairs to change, and he'd heard a crash moments later. When he rushed to the staircase, she was already at the bottom, motionless. It all seemed to make sense. People fall, accidents happen. But to Detective Elise Warren, who had been assigned to the case only out of formality, the scene felt too neat. She had been with the local department for over a decade, and while this was likely nothing more than a tragic fall, she had learned not to trust the surface of things. Something in Harold's demeanor unsettled her. He didn't ask questions, didn't cry. When they arrived, he was calm, too calm, not in shock, not confused, not hysterical. He just sat there, answering their questions with slow, deliberate words, never once straying from the same short explanation. Detective Warren began by checking phone records. Nothing unusual, a few calls to the florist, the caterer, their children, but one number came up repeatedly, always in the afternoon, always answered within minutes. It was a cell phone registered under the name Marcus Ellington, not a local, not in Margaret's known contacts. Warren called the number. A man answered, polite, well-spoken. He confirmed he had met Margaret just months earlier through a local history group online. They had corresponded, bonded over family genealogy. He admitted they had met in person twice, once for coffee, once for lunch, but insisted it was purely platonic. He hadn't even known she was married until recently, and once he did, he stepped away. He hadn't spoken to her in weeks. The detective pressed for detail. He explained that Margaret had seemed lonely, intelligent, curious. They exchanged stories about their families. He was researching a possible shared ancestry. That was all. He sounded sincere, but Warren made a note of him nonetheless. Then she looked at the physical evidence. The staircase was carpeted, no frayed edges, no loose boards. The light bulb in the hall had not burned out. It worked fine. Margaret's slippers were on her feet, her glasses tucked neatly on the nightstand upstairs. No signs of rushing, no signs of falling forward. Her injuries were severe, more consistent with being pushed than with slipping, but the report didn't say that. It was just Warren's gut. She returned to the house the next day, under the pretense of a follow-up. Harold welcomed her in. He offered tea, sat with his hands folded neatly in his lap. She asked about the night. He recounted it exactly as he had before, word for word, as if rehearsed. Then she noticed something. On a nearby table sat a leather-bound notebook, slightly worn, the edge of a photograph sticking out. She reached toward it instinctively, but Harold was quick to cover it with his hand. Just my notes, he said quietly. Things I jot down. She didn't push, not then, but she made a mental note. A few days later, Margaret was laid to rest in the town's cemetery. The funeral was quiet, closed casket. Harold stood by the gravesite, dry-eyed, staring down as if watching something disappear. As the final prayers were spoken, he didn't look up. He only whispered something under his breath that no one else heard. That night, Detective Warren requested a warrant, because one thing was becoming clear. If this was an accident, Harold Whitmore had done a masterful job convincing the world, but if it wasn't, if he had killed his wife on the night they were meant to celebrate their love, then the cracks in his story were about to widen, and someone was going to fall through. The search warrant was executed on a cloudy Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week after Margaret's funeral. The house was quiet when the officers arrived. Harold, dressed in his usual cardigan and slacks, opened the door without resistance. He said nothing, just stepped aside and let them in, as if he'd been expecting them all along. Detective Elise Warren entered last. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning every corner of the familiar interior. Nothing looked disturbed, everything in its place. The same antique clock ticked steadily on the mantel, the same framed photographs lined the walls, but Warren had come for what wasn't visible. They began in the living room, then moved to the bedrooms, methodically opening drawers, checking closets, lifting floorboards. Harold followed them silently, occasionally glancing toward the basement door. It was locked. When Warren asked for the key, he handed it over without a word. The basement was dim, lined with dusty shelves and toolboxes. In the far corner sat Harold's old workbench, where he'd once fixed watches and music boxes for the town's residents. Small drawers lined the wall behind it, labeled in his neat handwriting: springs, gears, pins, polish. Warren moved to the corner and began opening the drawers one by one. The third drawer from the bottom caught her attention. It didn't open all the way. Something was lodged behind it. With a sharp tug it gave way. Behind it, wrapped in an old cloth, were several pieces of paper and one photograph. The very same photograph Margaret had hidden in her nightstand, now creased and worn. Warren unfolded the paper. It was a printed email, from Marcus Ellington. The message was simple: "It's been lovely reconnecting. I hope to meet again soon. I've always admired you." The date matched the week before the anniversary. Alongside it was another note, handwritten in Margaret's script: "Don't worry about Harold. He's harmless." There it was, proof of something, not necessarily an affair but emotional intimacy, a connection, a secret Margaret had kept. Whether it was innocent or not didn't matter. It had meant something to Harold, enough to document, enough to bury. In another hidden drawer, Warren found a small leather-bound notebook. Each page was meticulously filled: dates, times, brief descriptions, Margaret's movements, phone calls, receipts, the flowers she brought home, what she wore. It was obsessive, detailed, disturbing.
But the final entry chilled her. She lies with her eyes open now. Even in sleep I know she's thinking of him. She smiles at nothing. She wears that blue scarf like it means something. I won't be humiliated. Not in my own house. Not after 60 years. This ends tonight. The date was their anniversary. When Warren returned upstairs, Harold was seated at the kitchen table. He didn't ask what they'd found. He only looked up as she entered and said, "I suppose you'll want to take me in now." She nodded once. He didn't protest. No rage, no panic, just a man who had finally run out of lies. At the station, during questioning, Harold spoke evenly. He admitted to pushing Margaret. He said she had just come downstairs, humming to herself. He couldn't look at her and couldn't stand the thought of her smiling at another man while lying beside him at night. He said he waited until her back was turned. One shove, that's all it took. He watched her fall, watched her body crumple, then sat down and waited. He said it was quiet after that, peaceful, even. The trial was swift, the evidence overwhelming. The jury took less than 3 hours to return a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Harold showed no emotion as the sentence was read, 25 years to life. He would die in prison. He knew it. Back in Willow Creek, the story spread like wildfire. People couldn't believe it. The couple who'd seemed so perfect, the marriage that had lasted 60 years, all shattered by jealousy, suspicion and silence. Some said Margaret had been unfaithful, others insisted she had simply craved connection. No one would ever really know, but one thing was certain, Harold's love had turned into possession, and when trust gave way to obsession, the anniversary that should have marked a lifetime of love, became the scene of an unthinkable tragedy, a love story, rewritten in blood.